Hi, welcome to the first presentation for this year's BAPT Symposium on psychological type. It's a pleasure to welcome a British Jungian scholar here today for the first presentation, Steve Myers. Thank you, Steve.
Great, thank you very much, Richard, for your introduction and for organising this symposium and for inviting me to be a part of it. I think it looks like being a very interesting couple of weeks, and there are going to be some great presentations, and I'm sure they'll spark some very interesting and important debates. You can see from the title screen that my academic association is with the University of Essex, but I actually live on a farm in North Yorkshire, about 6 hours away, and there's a small village nearby with only one streetlight, and the farmer was driving through the village one day, and that's his Land Rover in the background. You probably can't see it very clearly. And he saw a resident searching under the light, and the farmer stopped, and the resident explained that he'd lost a £50 note. So the farmer helped him search. And then after about 10 minutes, the farmer said, "Are you sure you lost it around here?" And the resident replied, "No, I lost it at the other end of the village, but there's no light here." Now, with this being Zoom, I've no idea whether anyone found that funny or whether it fell completely flat, but there is a serious point behind it that is relevant to my presentation and to some degree to the rest of the symposium. What exactly are we looking for, and are we looking in the right places? So let me go through my presentation. I'll come back to this question at the end. Over the past decade or so, I've been researching the deep psychological causes of religious and political conflict. That research has taken me away from typology and deeper into Jung's book, Psychological Types. Now, that may seem to be a paradox or oxymoron, because most people see Jung's book as being about typology, but Jung complained there was something more important than typology in that book that readers overlooked. As the psychoanalyst Claire Krellin points out in her review of Jung's theory of personality, Psychological Types is in fact a cryptic work hiding some of Jung's most radical ideas. So what I'd like to do in this presentation, after laying out some background, is to look at some of those radical ideas and describe some of the investigative research that I've been doing to test them out. I'll start by reviewing the three main paradigms that are relevant to this symposium. I'll then look at some objections Jung made that his main ideas were being overlooked. I'll review some of those ideas, attitudes, categories, philosophy, structure, participation, mystique, and transformation, and report on some of the investigative research I've just mentioned. At the end, I'll revisit the three paradigms and the question of what we are looking for and if we are looking in the right places. The word paradigm was popularized by Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He observed that the advancement of scientific knowledge was not based purely on rational factors, but also on lots of irrational and social factors. So when we look at the paradigms I'm about to describe, we need to unpack both the rational differences and the irrational ones, such as the effect of community and social identity theory. Now, there are lots of variations within these, but if we take a helicopter view, the three main paradigms we need to consider are Myers-Briggs typology, mainstream psychology, and Jungian and Post-Jungian theory, or analytical psychology. They are all relevant to this symposium. They each have different goals, different communities, and different criticisms of each other. For example, Myers-Briggs typology is built on the premise that there is something wrong with Jung's theory. Isabel Briggs-Myers lays out her criticism at the start of her book, Gifts Differing. She writes, "Jung ignores the auxiliary. He bypasses the combinations of perception and judgment, and thereby distorts descriptions of the individual introvert types." Jung is also criticized by mainstream psychology, though for different reasons. Academic psychologists tend to focus on Jung's personality, his attitudes of racism, anti-Semitism, his positive disposition towards the Nazis in the 1930s, and his lack of scientific rigor. These charges are sometimes exaggerated, but there is some degree of truth behind each one that needs careful unpacking, though I'm not planning to do that now. Mainstream psychology also criticizes Myers-Briggs typology for being based on Jung's theory, amongst other things. The other things can include the MBTI lacking predictive validity, types having strict cutoff points in the center of the scales, and this leading to a poor categorical reliability. And there are criticisms from the Jungian field. For example, Jung welcomed science and the scientific method, but he thought it had been taken too far. The much needed broadening of the mind by science has only replaced medieval one-sidedness by a new one-sidedness, the overvaluation of scientifically attested views. He saw science as being important, but only alongside other forms of knowledge, not instead of them. There is also Jungian criticism of Myers-Briggs typology. For example, in Jung and the Post-Jungians, Andrew Samuels writes that the grey wheelwright test and the Myers-Briggs type indicator are contrary to the basic Jungian idea that opposites can be transcended. So we have three paradigms, each of which have criticisms of the other two. As you saw from the agenda, I'm going to spend most of the time looking at the Jungian paradigm by reviewing Jung's objections to the popular reading of his book and his overlooked ideas. I'll come back to these three paradigms at the end. In 1920, Jung wrote a foreword to psychological types that said he was aiming it at lay people so they could make use of his ideas. Unfortunately, the way he structured the book made his ideas almost incomprehensible. The first 9 chapters are, in effect, one long literature review, and he buries his key ideas within his analysis of those earlier writers. The first example of Jung recognizing something was wrong in the reading of his book came in 1925. Whilst he was giving some seminars, he said that his philosophy, which he had introduced in chapter 1 of Psychological Types, had been misunderstood. I'll talk about this philosophy later because it is of fundamental importance to his theory. By the time we get to 1932, he knew that many readers were having difficulty with psychological types, and he acknowledged it in a letter. Another example is in 1934, he wrote the famous Argentine foreword, in which he dismissed the practice of categorizing people as a childish parlor game. I'll come back to this foreword later as well. In 1935, he complained in another letter that most readers had not noticed the gravamen of the book, that is, the most important part of it. According to Sonu Shamdasani, at some point, Jung came to the conclusion that lay people can't use typology. There is no date for that, but I suspect it was during the time of the ETH lectures on typology. This was obviously a significant step back from the original purpose of the book, which he had described in 1920 as being primarily for lay people. In September 1937, he wrote another foreword saying he was not going to revise the book because not even the basics of it had been properly understood. In October 1937, he met Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs-Myers. After that meeting, he sent them a copy of a paper from 1923, which I'll mention again later. Skipping forward a bit, in 1957, Richard Evans from the University of Houston interviewed Jung on film and asked him about the misinterpretation of his typological theory by some American writers. Jung responded with, "God preserve me from my friends," and he repeated several of the points he had made in the Argentine foreword in 1934. In 1960, a PhD student wrote to him asking for help with his research project that involved the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Jung refused, saying it did not reflect the purpose of his book. Now, I've skipped over an important incident in 1950, because against all this, we have to set a letter from Jung to Isabel Briggs-Myers. She sent him a copy of her questionnaire and asked to meet him when she was in Switzerland. His letter of reply is supportive, but it says he cannot meet her because of illness and holidays. However, this letter is misleading because it was not written by Jung. It was written by his assistant, Marie-Jean Schmidt. In Deirdre Baer's biography of Jung, she writes, of all the tasks Marie-Jean performed, Jung was most grateful to her for freeing him from the arduous responsibility of his correspondence. She answered all his letters, having learned quickly which required decision from Jung before she could reply. With Marie-Jean, he signed every letter and approved every typescript without more than a glance. And Schmidt wrote diplomatic replies that hid Jung's sometimes blunt views. For example, the Reverend Victor White described her as nobly acting as Dr. Jung's shock absorber when she was writing letters. Also, the letter written by Schmidt contained some untruths. She told Isabel Briggs-Myers that she couldn't meet Jung because he was recovering from an illness and then was going on holiday. However, he had already recovered from his illness, and the supposed holiday was only Jung going to Bollingen, where he continued to work and receive visitors. As Baer points out, Schmidt often used health as an excuse to avoid Jung meeting people. You can see more detail of this argument in an article in the Journal of Analytical Psychology. The bottom line is that Jung was unhappy with the popular reading of his book. Jung had intended to use typology as the exemplar of a different message, but by focusing only on the typology, readers were missing that message and thereby misrepresenting some of his key ideas. What I'll do now is go through some of those key ideas, starting with the centrality of attitude. For most people who use Myers-Briggs typology, the term attitude has a very narrow definition. It refers to introversion or extroversion and nothing else. In psychological types, however, Jung defines attitude in a very broad way. In fact, it is a much broader concept than type. He defines a type as an example, a characteristic specimen of an attitude. And when he gives examples of attitude, some are typological functions. However, others are not. For example, an oppressed person has a conscious attitude that always anticipates oppression. A power attitude is oriented by the power of the ego. A thinking attitude is oriented by the principle of logic. A sensation attitude is oriented by facts. Typological functions are a form of attitude. And Jung also discusses collective attitudes. For example, he described the Age of Enlightenment as nothing but a basic readjustment of a collective religious attitude. In his definitions, he mentions three types of attitude: individual, social, and typological. A key misunderstanding of his book is demonstrated by Myers-Briggs typology splitting people into two groups. This difference is due to, although Jung didn't use the term, a category error. Admittedly, part of the blame for this rests with Jung. He was a poor communicator and often failed to explain his ideas clearly. But he said, if you are going to categorize people, then there are three groups. In his 1923 paper, after talking about extroverts and introverts, he said, there is finally a third group. This group is the most numerous and includes the less differentiated normal man who is, by definition, influenced as much from within as from without. Jung's categorization of three groups can also be seen elsewhere, such as in a letter to a Dr. Schaefer in 1933. Schaefer had sent Jung his own system of typology and suggested that one needs at least 27 categories of people. Jung agreed. As you very rightly observe, one needs 27 categories and probably a few more besides in order to give an adequate characterization of mentally differentiated persons. Although Schaefer's typology was his own, the number 27 was significant to Jung because it is the minimum number you need if you're going to classify people into three groups. He defined three basic dimensions, and if there are three groups in each dimension, that gives 27 categories. Jung explains the category error in the letter to Schaefer. My typology aims not at characterizing personalities, but at classifying the empirical material. Your characterological aim is to sketch an adequate picture of a person's character. My typology aims at elucidating conceptually the empirical psychological material. This intention of mine has often been misunderstood. He makes the same point in the Argentine foreword. No book that makes an essentially new contribution enjoys being thoroughly understood. The types serve as point de repère in sorting out the empirical material. This has often been overlooked. My typology is to sort out the welter of empirical material. So what Jung is saying is that he categorizes psychic material into two types. This naturally leads to the classification of people into three. We can see how this principle works with the analogy of food. Let's consider two types of food material, fats and proteins. In these two images, we see a pure fat at the top and a pure protein powder at the bottom. But when you look at the actual foods we eat, these two types of food material are mixing in different amounts, which gives rise to three broad categories of food. We can see those three categories here. The cheese is mostly fat, the bacon is mostly protein, the chicken burger, I think it is a roughly equal mix of fat and protein. In the same way, in Jung's theory, there are two types of psychic material which can give rise to three categories of people. If we represent the different types of psychic material using color, we can see how each of the three paradigms analyze or categorize people. Mainstream psychology, which tends to use the big five, has only one color on each scale. It has no categories, it uses a continuum. Myers-Briggs typology has two categories. These two colors represent a key aspect of Jung's theory, that there are opposing attitudes or psychological functions. There is no gradation in the scales. There is a distinct cutoff point in the middle, which underpins many of the recurring criticisms from mainstream psychology. Jung's classification of material rather than people combines both of these. It includes the opposing attitudes or psychological functions, but it allows them to mix and interact in a way that gives rise to three colors: red at one end, blue at the other, and purple in the middle. The colors red and blue represent the psychological types, which act as reference points to understand each end of the spectrum. The purple represents Jung's middle group. Jung's two types of material and three groups of people potentially resolve some of the criticisms from mainstream psychology because they remove the contentious cutoff point in the middle. Also, they turn the stereotypical nature of the types into a positive quality because they are points of reference at the ends of the spectrum rather than an accurate description of an individual. I did some research on this middle group in my PhD, but it is ripe for much more investigation. Pardon me a second. Another part of the overlooked gravamen of Jung's book is his philosophy, which he called Essay in Anima. This is concerned with what we know of reality and the world. Jung called it epistemology, but nowadays it would probably be called metaphysics because the meaning of that term has changed since Jung's day. When Jung wrote the Argentine foreword, he said he would recommend readers who really want to understand my book to immerse themselves, first of all, in chapters 2 and 5. I'm going to beg to differ a little because I think chapter 1 is just as important as those two chapters. It is in chapter 1 that Jung introduces his philosophy, and in doing so, he lays an important foundation for his later discussions of reality, a word that appears very frequently in the book. To explore the nature of Jung's philosophy, I'm going to draw on the writings of William James, John Dewey, and W.V.O. Quine. This is because, although he doesn't acknowledge it, Jung's philosophy is closely based on William James's late developed philosophy of radical empiricism. Jung learned about it through Theodore Flournoy. Dewey and Quine used the same ideas in their philosophies and provided useful terms and illustrations. Jung introduced Essay in Anima by saying, living reality is the product neither of the actual objective behavior of things, nor of the formulated idea exclusively, but rather the combination of both, through Essay in Anima. That is, the external world and the psyche interact to create reality. Jung illustrates this elsewhere using the analogy of the color green. Color is produced through the interaction of an external wavelength and the individual's body-mind perception. In a similar way, Esse in Anima suggests that all reality is produced through the interaction of the external world and the person's psyche. William James's explanation went a bit further. He said, reality is not only produced by the interaction of the person and the world, but also by the interactions between interactions. We can see this in the example of the flag of Wales. Each of the colours is, individually, the product of the interaction between external wavelengths and the individual psyche. But the flag of Wales is produced through the interactions between the colours and between their spatial positions. The reality of the flag is created by interactions between interactions. John Dewey explored the implications of this using the example of three people with three different lived experiences of a horse. To a family man, it was a means of transport in that day. To a horse trader, it was an asset. To a paleontologist, it is a product of evolution. Dewey says these aren't different experiences of one reality, they are different reals of experience. That is, reality is pluralistic. Quine called this idea ontological relativity. He illustrated it with a translator trying to work out the meaning of the word gavagai in a new language. When someone says gavagai and points to a rabbit, they could be referring to a rabbit or separate rabbit parts or a quality of rabbitness. When translating, we can only know the meanings we ascribe. There is no objective fact of the matter. Quine extends this principle to ontology or reality and concludes that reality is multiply relative. I want to give my own illustration of the principle that reality is multiply relative because it is of fundamental importance in Jung's theory. In this illustration, a truck driver is doing an emergency stop whilst blowing the horn. There are three other people in the scene, two pedestrians and the person in the road who the truck driver is trying to avoid. The truck comes to a stop short of the person in the road, but the driver continues to blow the horn. What the truck driver hears is a constant pitch from the horn. Because of the Doppler effect, combined with the slowing down of the truck, the first pedestrian hears a short descending pitch from the horn, then a big drop in pitch as the truck goes past. Then the pitch gradually rises as the truck continues to slow down, and when the truck stops, the pitch becomes constant. What the second pedestrian hears is similar, but there are some key differences. The first descending pitch goes on for longer. Then there is a small drop in pitch, then a short rise, and finally the pitch becomes constant. What the person in the road hears is different again. There is a descending pitch followed by a constant pitch. There are also other differences, such as patterns in the change of volume. So for each of these four people, the pattern of the horn is different, though they assume they all hear the same thing. These patterns are real, but none of them exist independently in the outer world, nor are they purely imagined by the observer. Each reality is constructed through the interaction of the person's position in the world and the horn. In Esse in Anima, Jung extends this principle to the psyche. Our different psyches help to create different but related realities. Let's return to that quote from Psychological Types. Living reality is the product neither of the actual objective behavior of things, the horn, nor of the formulated idea exclusively, the person, but rather the combination of both through Esse in Anima. That is, the external world and the psyche interact to create reality. So our attitudes, complexes, memories, archetypes, etc., are all involved in the creation of reality. And the psyche itself furnishes the material to create that bridge between the two through an activity that Jung calls fantasy. The psyche creates reality every day and fashions the bridge of reality between subject and object. The key point is that because the psyche is involved in creating reality, the realities of our different worlds reflect, at least in part, the structures of our own personal psyches. Jung introduces his philosophy in chapter 1 of Psychological Types. It leads into another of Jung's key ideas because in chapter 2, he goes on to discuss the structure of attitudes that develops in the psyche. It tends to split. We tend to develop a superior attitude that comes to dominate consciousness, and it has an opposite inferior attitude that remains unconscious. Jung uses typological functions as an exemplar, which is apparent in the Myers-Briggs concept of dominant and inferior function. But this structure can develop with any attitudes and any opposites. Throughout the book, Jung uses examples that not only include typological functions, but also other individual attitudes and collective attitudes of politics, religion, and culture. The difference between the superior and inferior attitudes is not only that one dominates consciousness and the other is unconscious, they also develop superior and inferior qualities. The properties of the superior attitude are sophisticated, nuanced, more moral, a better quality, more abstract, creative, active, and consciously directed. The properties of the inferior attitude are primitive, simplistic, evil, poorly thought through, passive, and all concreted, mixed up together with other parts of the unconscious. Jung uses this dualistic structure in his example descriptions of the psychological types. But when combined with Jung's philosophy of esse in anima, this structure is not just in our own psyche, but our world is also structured along these superior, inferior lines. This isn't just a worldview. As Julian Quine said, there isn't one reality that we each have different views of. We each have different realities, although they are related. Reality consists of ontological properties, and those properties reflect the superior-inferior structure within our own psyche. In the analogy of architecture, some buildings may be more colourful, have a cleaner design, and have a bigger presence. Other buildings may be dirty, small, and indistinct. Going back to the spectrum diagram we looked at earlier, if one person is towards the red end, then their world has superior red qualities and inferior blue ones. For the person at the blue end, the qualities of the world they live in are reversed. The combination of esse in anima with Jung's theory of opposites is one of Jung's radical ideas. Jung was an admirer of Einstein and his theories of relativity. This combination of esse in anima with the superior-inferior structure is Jung's psychological equivalent. It is a sort of psychological theory of relativity. Reality is related to our own psyche, and when we have different structures in the psyche, we have different realities, and they're antagonistic to each other. The reality presupposed by one instinct is different from the reality of the other. I've been doing some investigative research to see whether or how this idea plays out in the area of politics. I used an online questionnaire to compare the realities of those on either side of the Brexit debate. This was a couple of years after the referendum in 2016 on whether the UK should remain in or leave the European Union. The comparison is between ontological properties. I looked at which of the two campaign organisations had superior or inferior properties, as reported by the study participants. I correlated their responses to their personal attitudes towards the EU. What I found was that people who wanted to remain in the EU tended to report that the Remain campaign was honest and it used fair tactics, and the Leave campaign was dishonest and used scaremongering tactics. These are ontological properties of the two campaigns. But for those people who wanted the UK to leave the EU, the ontological properties were reversed. They tended to say that the Remain campaign was dishonest and used scaremongering, It was the Leave campaign that was honest and used fair tactics. This graph shows the same results on a continuum. The more someone identified as a leaver, the more the Remain campaign was dishonest and used scaremongering. The more someone identified as a Remainer, the more the Leave campaign was dishonest and used scaremongering. The reality they experienced was relative to their own psyche. The criticism of the Leave campaign's dishonesty was based on various claims they made, most notably that the UK sends £350 million per week to the European Union. They put this claim on the side of a big red bus. The criticism of the Remain campaign was also based on various claims, such as the average household being £4,300 worse off each year if the UK were to leave the European Union. The Chancellor, George Osborne, made this claim in a speech. There was an independent examination of these claims by the UK Parliament's House of Commons Treasury Committee. They concluded that both numbers could be found in the calculations, but they were both being misrepresented and exaggerated by around a factor of 3. The claims were also looked at by the Full Fact website after the referendum and after a BBC Question Time audience member said that both sides were equally guilty of dishonesty. Full Fact concluded that this statement was correct. In fact, Full Fact said, sometimes the two campaigns even made false claims about the false claims made by each other. So this small study provides some support for the combination of esse and anima with the superior-inferior structure in the psyche as applied to politics. That is, a superior-inferior reality is created between objective events and the superior-inferior structure within the person. This may be a hard conclusion for some people to accept. A Remainer, for example, might insist that the Leave campaign lied more and vice versa. This reaction is due to the assumption that there is a single absolute reality. There is another radical aspect of this, which is again buried in the cryptic writings in psychological types. Jung doesn't say this explicitly, but by putting the cryptic pieces together, we can infer from his theory that the more we differentiate an internal attitude, then the more one-sided external reality becomes. I explored this by comparing the degree of differentiation of a political attitude with the external reality of opposing political parties. As a rough measure of political differentiation, I decided to combine two variables. The first was the degree to which the person identified with one side of the left-right political spectrum or the other. The second was the individual's level of political knowledge. Combining these two variables provides, broadly speaking, 9 categories of political differentiation. The columns represent those who identify on the left, in the centre, or on the right. I apologise for the confusing colours for those in the US. In the UK, red is left and blue is right. The 3 rows show the degree of political knowledge. Knowing nothing is at the bottom, knowing something about politics is in the middle row, and knowing a lot about politics is at the top. An undifferentiated political standpoint would be in the middle box at the bottom, knowing nothing about politics and either not having any political identification or identifying in the centre. A one-sided political differentiation would be in the top left or the top right boxes, knowing a lot about politics and identifying with either the left or the right. This table that I'm showing you here is the internal psyche side of the comparison, and I'm going to look at the external side. And I put those, the external reality inside those boxes. And what I was looking at in this particular piece of research was the ontological property of political extremism. That is, was there any difference in the extremism of a party on the left and a party on the right? For UK respondents, the comparison was between Labour and Conservative. For the US and the rest of the world, it was between Democrat and Republican. The result of this comparison of internal psyche and the extent to which it's differentiated and external reality was that when you identify in the center, or if you have no knowledge of politics, there is no difference in the extremism of the two parties. But it changes with greater political differentiation. On average, the more the respondent identified with one side of the political spectrum and the more political knowledge they had, then the more the party on the other side was extremist. This is the same result presented in a different way. The horizontal axis shows where people identified on the political spectrum. The vertical axis shows which external party was more extreme. The lines show the different levels of knowledge, with red being the most. The structure of reality tilts with more differentiation of a political standpoint. There's one more radical idea from psychological types that can be related to this political dimension: participation mystique. In essence, it means that when we identify with a person, a group, or an idea, our thoughts and behavior tend to conform to the norm for that group. Jung draws the term from Levi-Bruhl, who uses it to describe a peculiar kind of connection with objects. Jung uses it to denote a psychological conformity through identification. The subject is covered fairly extensively in Shared Realities, a book of essays edited by the Jungian analyst Mark Winborn. Winborn suggests that participation mystique is not inherently good or bad, but an unavoidable and necessary fact of life. It can have either positive or negative consequences. Being a Jungian analyst, he relates it primarily to the interaction between a psychotherapist and a patient. Winborn summarizes participation mystique by writing, "It is an unconscious component of the civilized adult. It forms the basis for empathy through projection and identification. The shadow of empathy, namely the danger of participation mystique, is lack of conscious evaluation. We do not realize that we are not free from participation mystique and that many of our life assumptions depend on it." Winborn also cites work by Erich Neumann that provides a pointer for how it might relate to the field of politics. In participation mystique, a specific type of knowledge is available. Neumann refers to this as field knowledge, which is exchanged between one being and another existing within the same reality field. This diagram is a version of one used by Jung and Winborn, usually to explain the relationships between the conscious and unconscious of two people, such as an analyst and client. In this case, however, it shows the relationships between the person and the collective or shared reality field. Participation mystique is the red line at the bottom, an unconscious relation between the person and the group that tends to make the person conform to group norms. To test this, participants were asked about their views in 3 disparate policy areas: pay, decision-making, and status. What I was seeking to establish is whether, as people differentiate a political attitude, their views tend to become deconstructed and more varied, or, as participation mystique suggests, more aligned and conforming to the norm for that political group. The results were as follows. For the group of people with the lowest level of political differentiation, who said they had no political knowledge, there were no correlations between these areas of policy and their political orientation. The results were not statistically significant. For the group with some political differentiation, who knew something about politics, some correlations do start to appear, and all in the same direction. However, they are only small correlations. For the group with the greatest level of political differentiation, those who knew a lot about politics, some clearer correlations emerged, and all in the same direction. This suggests that as we differentiate a political attitude, our views do not tend to deconstruct. Rather, they move in the direction of conforming with the norms at each end of the spectrum. We can better visualize what is happening with this graph. The gray bars show the number of people whose answers were a mix of left, right, or center. The red and blue bars show people whose answers were all to the left or all to the right. The 3 sets of columns are for increasing political differentiation. We can see in the final column that as political knowledge increases, the number of people answering questions all on the left and all on the right increases. They sort of move out to the sides. Okay, so the last radical idea I want to discuss is the main idea of the book, which appears in chapter 5 of Psychological Types. Jung describes how the psyche overcomes the superior-inferior structure so that conflicting attitudes can be reconciled within the individual and conflicting and antagonistic realities can be reconciled between different people and groups. To cut a very long story short, chapter 5 involves developing a third attitude that transcends and reconciles what were previously the superior and inferior attitudes. I did some research on this in my PhD using factor analysis, but for this presentation, I'll just describe an example. The Reverend Ian Paisley was for many years the leading representative of one side of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. He was a unionist wanting Northern Ireland to stay part of the UK and a Protestant. The opposites to those attitudes were nationalism, wanting United Ireland, and Roman Catholicism, the main religion in the Republic of Ireland. Paisley's external reality reflected the superior-inferior structure of his attitudes. For example, he described himself as having superior ontological properties, saying, "I am here tonight by the grace of God, a sinner saved by grace." Sinn Féin, representing the nationalists and Catholics, had inferior properties. They are not fit to be in partnership with decent people. It will be over our dead bodies if they ever get there. That second statement was made in 2006. And one of the leading members of Sinn Féin at the time was Martin McGuinness. In the 1970s, he was in the IRA and spent time in prison for terrorist activities. He was the chief negotiator for Sinn Féin leading up to the Good Friday Agreement. However, Paisley refused to recognise that agreement and did not take part, which contributed to its collapse between 2002 and 2007. So Paisley's statement in 2006 was directed largely at Martin McGuinness. It reflects the one-sided attitudes that Paisley had held for at least 70 years. But at the time he made this statement, the structure of his attitudes was already beginning to change. And over the next few months, there was a remarkable transformation. The following year, Paisley agreed to enter into a power-sharing arrangement with Sinn Féin. Paisley became the first minister of Northern Ireland and Martin McGuinness became his deputy. The two men not only worked together in power sharing, but they forged a strong friendship and became known as the Chuckle Brothers because they were often caught laughing in each other's presence. This was a remarkable transformation in Paisley's attitude. It didn't change his identity as a unionist and Protestant, but it changed his identification with it. Instead, he became committed to a third attitude, the desire to make the power sharing process work. This attitude brought the opposites together, acting as a mediator between the two sides of Paisley and between Paisley and McGuinness. We can't know exactly what it was that changed Paisley's attitude, and it may have been a combination of things that built up over a period of time. But the change in his attitude and the image of him laughing and joking with Martin McGuinness had a big impact on the collective attitudes in Northern Ireland. It was a symbol that canalized libido so that power sharing became embedded in the dominant collective attitude in Northern Ireland. I've covered a lot of ground so far in this presentation, so let me just provide a quick summary of the key points before I just then go into the final section, talking about the three paradigms. I think this slide best sums up the radical ideas in psychological types. Jung's theory suggests that we all have a superior-inferior structure of attitudes within the psyche that helps to shape our individual and shared realities along a superior-inferior axis. The worlds that we live in are related but different. And this structure needs to be transformed one pair of opposites at a time to overcome the various intrapersonal, interpersonal, and intercultural conflicts that this structure creates. This theory is Jung's psychological equivalent to Einstein's theory of relativity. Jung knew Einstein before he wrote Psychological Types, and as he explained in a letter, Professor Einstein was my guest on several occasions at dinner. This was in the early 1910s. It was Einstein who first started me off thinking about a possible relativity of time as well as space and their psychic conditionality. Also, a correspondent wrote to Jung and compared Freud to Newton and Jung to Einstein. Jung liked the comparison. Your comparison of Freud and myself is quite correct. Freud is essentially concretistic like Newton, and I'm chiefly impressed by the relativity of psychological phenomena. Jung failed to credit Einstein's influence on him any earlier than this for complex reasons, which Orsi Lukács has been investigating in her research. Although Jung decided not to revise psychological types, he continued to develop both his philosophy of psychological relativity and his theory of opposites. Psychological relativity progressed through Jung's collaborative research with Wolfgang Pauli on the relation of psyche and physics. The theory of opposites progressed through the metaphor of alchemy, which culminated in Jung's last great work, Mysterium Conjunctionis. Psychological types was Jung's first great work, published great work, though it was aimed at a lay audience because he wanted it to be of practical use. But the cryptic nature of the book meant that his main messages were inaccessible to most readers. Myers-Briggs typology has taken a significant step in interpreting it, but it only focuses on typology. It has a cut-down version of psychological relativity in the form of different worldviews, and it stops short of promoting the transformation of attitudes. Isabel Briggs-Myers acknowledged that Isabel Briggs-Myers acknowledged that process of transformation, but only briefly. In Gifts Differing, she writes, people can ultimately transcend their type. This is admirable, but if it is attempted before the person has achieved full development, it may have a negative effect. On these points of sequence and risk, I think she and Jung would agree. But then Isabel Briggs-Myers sees no need to transcend attitudes. She says, I'm sure it's possible to get a great deal more respect for the third and fourth and to make a great deal more of them, but I never advise anything more than getting them into the service of the functions you care about most, your best functions. This stops short of the transformation Jung discusses in chapter 5. Isabel Briggs-Myers is setting our highest ambition as being to develop a good hierarchy of attitudes within the psyche. But the Jungian ambition, though not shared by all Jungians, is to go beyond type. For example, the Jungian analyst Joseph Wheelwright suggested that the most important thing about types is de-typing. Frida Fordham puts it a different way in her book, An Introduction to Jung's Psychology. Jung recommended this book as a good introduction to his theory. He wrote the foreword to it and said that she has delivered a fair and simple account of the main aspects of my psychological work. What Fordham says about typology is this: most people use one function or its modification. More complicated people use two functions. And a very highly differentiated personality would make use of three functions. The inclusion of the fourth function belongs to what Jung has called the individuation process and the reconciliation of the opposing trends of one's nature. Individuation starts at the point where Isabel Briggs-Myers' typology and type development stops. And what happens when we go past that point has been described by Marie-Louise von Franz. When the fourth function comes up, the whole conscious structure collapses. This then produces a stage where everything is neither thinking, nor feeling, nor sensation, nor intuition. Something new comes up, namely a completely different and new attitude toward life, in which one uses all and none of the functions all of the time. So let's return to the three paradigms I introduced at the start, and also the question posed by the story of the villager looking for a £50 note. There are, of course, lots of variations within and between these paradigms. But when we ask, what are we looking for and where are we looking, there are often different answers in each one. In mainstream psychology, for example, the client and the subject are often different. The psychologist assesses one person and reports to a second, a business manager or a health service commissioner. In analytical psychology, the client and subject are the same. In Myers-Briggs typology, the questionnaire is meant to be for the subject to assess themselves, though in some contexts there might be a separation of client and subject. For the psychologist, a psychometric is a diagnostic or predictive tool to enable them to assess another person. But the MBTI practitioner is giving the client a heuristic tool to learn about themselves. In analytical psychology, typology forms part of the process of helping the client achieve self-transformation. The subtitle of the original English translation of psychological types was The Psychology of Individuation, that is, of transforming oneself into a unique individual. The primary focus for the psychologist is the present, from which predictions about the near future are sometimes made. In Myers-Briggs typology, the focus is on discovering the origins of one's personality, one's original typological disposition. For Jung, the focus is teleological, on the unique individual you can become through the process of transformation between the opposites. The approach of the paradigms is also different. The Myers-Briggs focus on origins means that although it uses Jungian concepts, it is actually more Freudian, more reductive. For Jung, a reduction back to types is only a stage to go through before then looking forward to the construction. That's the teleological becoming. Mainstream psychology's approach is driven more by science and statistics. The big five emerged out of factor analysis, not out of a theory. The philosophical underpinnings are also different. Psychology tends to be based on the idea that we all have different perceptions of a single world. Myers-Briggs typology introduces the idea that we have different worldviews that need reconciling. Jung's philosophy takes that one step further into the ontology defined by James, Dewey, and Quine, that we all live in different but related worlds. As we saw in the red, blue, and purple spectrums, their approach to categorization is different. Mainstream psychology has only one category that exists on a continuum. Myers-Briggs typology has two categories. Analytical psychology categorizes the material rather than the person, which leads to three groups. Mainstream psychology tends to focus on traits. Analytical psychology tends to take a holistic approach that is more akin to systems theory. Myers-Briggs typology is more a blend of the two. And finally, mainstream psychology privileges one form of knowledge, which is scientific. Myers-Briggs typology recognizes there are different forms of knowledge furnished by each of the different worldviews. Analytical psychology is even more pluralistic, recognizing the role of the individual and collective psyche in creating knowledge and in creating reality. There is validity in all of these, depending on the context. The problems arise when we have a superior-inferior structure that valorizes one paradigm, but disparages one or both of the others. Each paradigm has a contribution to make to the development of culture, for example, in reality checking or providing heuristic discovery or in transforming attitudes. Myers-Briggs typology can play a significant role in integrating these perspectives and leading the development of culture because it is such a popular and powerful heuristic. But to integrate the other two paradigms and make that wider contribution, some adjustments to theory are needed. The first is that Myers-Briggs typology needs to open the door to vertical development and provide a path towards transcending type. That doesn't mean becoming some form of superhuman being or overcoming our limitations or becoming a religious mystic. It means learning how to replace our one-sided superior-inferior structure with a new attitude that is fairer and more balanced as regards the various opposing attitudes. Importantly, this will also change the reality of the world we experience. Also, Myers-Briggs typology has the potential to be a prototype or exemplar of how we overcome other forms of opposing attitudes in politics, religion, and culture. We might start with the heuristic that explains how to reconcile our differing typological attitudes, but the process can then be adapted to these other fields. This doesn't mean interpreting political attitudes in terms of typological functions or attitudes, but integrating antagonistic attitudes of various types that are unrelated to typology. And finally, we need to address the problem of the middle. The strict cutoff point is problematic for numerous reasons. If we accept there is a third category that arises from the two types of material, this opens up a whole new field of research. There is a lot to be said about this middle, but that would take another hour, so I'll stop here. The book Psychological Types may now be 100 years old, but there is still plenty of material in there for us to discover. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to stop the recording now.